So there's a lot going on. I find it curious that we have one of the more violent and gory gospel texts that we get in our lectionary cycle, and thinking in particular of the tragic events yesterday that I'm sure most all of you are aware of, the assassination attempt on President Trump. So that caused me to revisit my sermon a little bit, as you might imagine. I've been reading a little bit of American history lately. Eric Larson is one of my favorite authors, and a new book came out just a couple months back from him called The Demon of Unrest. And this book is about the history of the United States between kind of the election of Abraham Lincoln to the assault on Fort Sumter. So that period of time when things really pivoted towards the opening shots of the American Civil War. The thing that strikes me about that book, among others, is that there's a lot of violence in this world. There is a lot of violence in the history of the United States. I don't know as we're medal winners in that race, but there is a lot of violence in the history of our nation. For those of us who are alive now, at this particular moment in history, we think perhaps fondly, particularly if we're white, particularly if we're straight, of the period of time during and following the Second World War for 3 decades or so, give or take. But if we're honest and look at the full swath of US history, that's a very anomalous period of time. We have been often at each other's throats throughout our history as a nation. But if we go back further, this text doesn't sound so great either, right? We certainly don't have a monopoly on this business of violence. But I want to talk about a different gospel text before I get to this one. It is the text in which Jesus is crucified. And we ask ourselves theologically, well, why did this happen? Or think to our own souls and say, what did I ever do that required this kind of solution? I'm a pretty nice person. What's all the hype about? Why all the drama? But one of the things that struck me in this reading and in our common history together, do you notice how there is always someone who does the ordering, and there is always someone available doing the doing, right? Throughout history, we don't seem to have a shortage of these folks. And I would suggest that often, not always, but often, these are men. These are men involved in these things. As we look at the story of Jesus in his crucifixion, one of the things that is particularly striking is that if there was a medal for violence, the Romans would be in serious running. Crucifixion, just about the most horrific way of executing someone invented by humankind. Now, one might ask, why is humankind inventing these kinds of things? Excellent question. But other aspects of this are important too. What do we need to be saved from? Why do we need to be saved? If we think of the sequence leading up to the crucifixion of Christ, we think of whipping, we think of a crown of thorns, we think of a man nailed in his wrists and feet to a cross. What are we capable of doing to one another? Horrible, horrific things. And what is our sense of what God is calling us to be about? Is it about violence over and against others? We can go back to the Crusades. We can go back to any number of periods of time. But is that the model that we have from Christ in the Gospels? Turn the other cheek? What does it mean to act towards life? to nurture the well-being of our neighbor. Martin Luther said it very well as we think of the 10 Commandments in the Small Catechism. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet from your neighbor. Luther took it a step further. Not only are we not to covet and steal, but we should do everything we can to build up our neighbor. I think it's important. I mean, it wasn't originally written in English, but there's no footnoting. Unless your neighbor's a jerk, unless they vote for the party that you don't like, unless this, that, or the other. There aren't exceptions to this. I was reading an article several years ago. Anthropologists were studying primates of various varieties, including those of us sitting in this room, and they were commenting on how humans have very different hand structures. And they were trying to understand why the difference in the hand structure from humankind to others. And one of the ideas is that the human fist is actually ideally suited for striking. How many generations does it take such that you become increasingly efficient and skilled at striking? When we look at the text that we have for today, we see other elements of human brokenness. So Herod, by all accounts, is an odd duck. I don't know what odd duck is in Greek, but he's a strange fellow. And he's having this party, and his wife's former brothers, it's awkward as you got in the text, her daughter is dancing for him and the guests. It's kind of okay. And then he invites her to ask for anything. Now you can picture this. What is he doing? He's bragging, right? You can picture him kind of puffed up in front of his guests and all of those that are there. I'm the big man in the room, and you can have anything you want. And she runs off, and like every little girl, asks for the head of the prophet in the jail on a platter. And that's just, what does that say about humankind? Our ability to inflict pain, injury, death. Now, we might talk about that in diminished opportunities or concerns about rights, but today I think we need to remember that that also includes life itself. We can think of places like the Holy Land today. We can think of places like Ukraine, any number of places that are on fire with violence towards one another. In the midst of that, it seems to me that what Jesus has called us to be about by example is not just countercultural, it's counter our very DNA. It is to live in a way that is different from the way in which we are hardwired to live. It is not easy. When people are different from us and have different ideas, suddenly we start to get ramped up. We start piling on. We think of the events yesterday at that political rally in Pennsylvania. We see how easily we slip from words and dialogue to violence. I remember when our kids were very little, there was a phrase that we would use occasionally. Use your words, right? Don't just throw things. Don't just shoot things. Use your words. I don't know that the trajectory of my sermon this morning is straight in line with the gospel reading. But it felt important to talk a little bit about this human condition of ours. The human condition that doesn't just affect other people. It affects us as well. a profound sense to ask Christ into our hearts in a way that causes us and drives us to bring peace and life when the world around us is screaming violence, right? Even in the face of disaster, there are all kinds of ways in which we can be countercultural and act towards good. I'll close on a saying from Mr. Rogers, arguably one of the best human beings in the history of human beings, and a Presbyterian pastor, if you didn't know that. He said that his mother would often tell him when he saw disaster happening on television, reports from horrible situations, and an understanding of where is God in this, where is the hope? And his mother would always say, look for the helpers. Look for the helpers. So how are we called in a world that is so violent to be the helpers, the healers, the neighbors that God has called us to be? Amen. Please stand as you are able.